chapter 14. I spent a long time on verse 26, the idea that Antioch, now this was not the Pisidian Antioch, it was the Syrian Antioch. I'm sorry, not sorry, but that's the distinction we got to make. Okay. And how that church had, when they commissioned Paul and Barnabas to what we have as their first missionary journey, that they had been committed to the grace of God for the work. It's a big deal. In my mind, it's a huge deal. Okay, verse 27. On arriving there, Antioch, they gathered the church together and reported all that God had done through them and how he had opened a door of faith to the Gentiles. And they stayed there for a long time with the disciples. We don't know how long. Luke doesn't give us that as a part of his narrative. But this is just kind of a normal stuff here. Like, okay, the sending church, I think Paul and Barnabas felt they deserved to know what had happened. And the big thing that Paul and Barnabas reported was, in addition to the things that God had done through them, which I take to be, there were miracles, okay? There was response to pretty serious, very serious persecution, at least in Lystra. And, all the way from Pisidian Antioch down to Derbe and back, they met resistance. But the big thing is that God had opened a door of faith to the Gentiles. As Gentiles in this century, I doubt that we just nod and say, well, yeah, that's what happened. If we could experience this anywhere near the way these first century Gentiles did, it would be, I think it would be life altering. Now, Paul and Barnabas were reporting to the church at Antioch, which was primarily Jewish, that Gentiles had been given a doorway of faith. And I believe that by this time there were Gentiles as well in this church at Antioch. It was here at Antioch that the disciples were first called Christians. Remember that. And this would have, I think, everybody there would have said, that is amazing how wonderful the grace of God is. Well, okay. Let's move on to chapter 15, but probably we should throw some confetti that we've actually completed a chapter and are moving on. I think the real way to say that is we completed a chapter and now we will crawl forward. Acts 15. Certain people came down from Judea to Antioch. Stop there, because I think remembering that everything away from Jerusalem was down for the Jew. If you were going north from Jerusalem, that was down. If you're going east or west, that was down. So, because geographically, coming from Judea to Antioch was, in terms of the compass, up. But, okay. Certain people came down from Judea to Antioch and were teaching believers, unless you are circumcised according to the custom taught by Moses, you cannot be saved. Ooh. Verse 2. You would expect this. This brought Paul and Barnabas into sharp dispute and debate with them. So Paul and Barnabas were appointed, along with some other believers, to go up to Jerusalem to see the apostles and elders about this question. The whole book of Galatians that Paul wrote as a letter to the church in Galatia, quite some time after this, it is a full-on frontal attack on the idea that you got to be a full-on bona fide Jewish follower of God in order to be saved. Ephesians chapter 2, verse 10. It's by grace you have been saved through faith, and that not of yourselves, so that no one could boast. It is a gift from God. Okay, now, that some people say, well, Paul evolved in his understanding as he moved on. And of course, he was the guy was a brainiac. Brainiacs tend to grow their understanding, okay? But I truly believe that what brought Paul and Barnabas into such sharp debate and dispute with these Jews from Judea was because they already knew and were convinced, they were convicted that it wasn't by following the Jewish law that we are saved. It's by God's grace. Okay. Well, the church, this is it. I feel that this is the result of the Christians at Antioch seeking out wisdom from God. Paul and Barnabas were appointed, and this is the middle of verse 2, along with some other believers, to go up to Jerusalem to see the apostles and elders about this question. In other words, they were going to run it up the chain. That was how they would figure this thing out. They were convinced that God would speak in that way and bring clarity. Okay. Just a little point. I can't say it's never a bad idea, but I can almost say never. It is almost always a good idea to seek other opinions, the wisdom of other people, but you seek that wisdom from the wise, not the equally confused. Okay, verse 3. The church sent them on their way, and as they traveled through Phoenicia and Samaria, they told how the Gentiles had been converted. This made the believers, all the believers, very glad. Seems to be a conflict there, a dispute, if you will, between these Jewish followers of Jesus who came from Judea to Antioch, and evidently they felt they were on a mission to turn these people to God's actual design. Well, when the other Jews, other Christians, other believers, all the believers, the indication is everywhere that Paul and Barnabas and the group that had been sent by the church at Antioch, everywhere they stopped and spoke with believers, all the believers were very glad to hear that the Gentiles had been converted. Verse 4, when they came to Jerusalem, they were welcomed by the church and the apostles and elders, to whom they reported everything God had done through them. This, and I know I always make mountains out of molehills, but in the first century, all of the information, the news that the elders and apostles in Jerusalem would have received about Paul and Barnabas' activity and activity of God in the world, the broader world than what they were located in, was all word of mouth. And they were, of course, very interested in what has God been up to with and through you. Again, Paul and Barnabas, I think, are the people who offered this report. They essentially would have told them the same thing that they told the church at Antioch. And then verse 5, then some of the believers who belonged to the party of the Pharisees stood up and said, before I go with what they said, you got to remember, these people were believers, but they belonged to the party of the Pharisees. The party of the Pharisees was somewhat political, but not in the sense that we might frame it with the dichotomy between Republicans and Democrats in our country and independents. But this was a somewhat of a theological division and then a practical division. The Pharisees, the Pharisees were the religious sect party that were most intent on murdering Jesus. It was because, this I think is important to understand about the Pharisees, because what was more important to them than anything else was the law, adhering to the law. And anything that was outside of that was morally wrong, punishably wrong. And they saw Jesus as outside of that. And so the death penalty. So these were, there were some, I think of two primary. One was Gamaliel, whether he was a Pharisee. I believe he would have been a Pharisee, because Paul, in the book of Philippians, he gives his pedigree, and he says, I was a Pharisee, a Jew among Jews. I was a Pharisee of Pharisees. Well, Paul had been educated by Gamaliel. Okay. I also think of Nicodemus. John 3, where at night, Nicodemus came to Jesus and asked, what's this about? And we the story. Probably grade school kids may not know the whole story, but they know John 3:16 if they've been raised up in the church. So, okay, not every Pharisee was this narrow-minded, bigoted, misogynist, but most were. The Pharisees some of the believers who belonged to the party of the Pharisees. So they had retained their fundamental traditional beliefs as Pharisees, and yet had believed in Jesus. This is hard for me to imagine today, but I think not so much during this period of time. One of the problems that Pharisees have, and oh, by the way, they exist today, although they don't call themselves Pharisees, but the problem is they become legalists. And I don't have time to talk as much about legalism as I'm going to, so I'm going to shut it down for today, and next time I'm going to talk about legalism on So Care with Stevie Boy.